Thank you very much, Dr. Farouk, with a very enlightening introduction for our program and addressing the important point about why is it the discussion about Islam and reform is still very much important and critical within the setting of our society in Malaysia and also in other countries and other parts of the world. So moving next is for us to move straight away to the keynote session that we're going to have with Dr. Chandra Muzaffar. So even though we know generally Dr. Chandra Muzaffar requires no introduction, I will just briefly look into his background. He's the president of the International Movement for a Just World, JUST, an international NGO based in Malaysia which seeks to critique global injustice guided by universal spiritual and moral values. He has published extensively on civilizational dialogue, international politics, religion, human rights, and Malaysian society. Among Dr. Chandra's latest publications are A World in Crisis, Is There a Cure?, and reflections on Malaysian unity and other challenges. Apart from his role in JUST, Dr. Chandra sits on the board of a number of international NGOs concerned with social justice and civilizational dialogue. Dr. Chandra is the recipient of a number of international awards related to his scholarship and social activism. So in regards to the topic and theme of our program, Dr. Chandra is going to deliver a talk on Muslim societies and reform within a changing global environment. Interesting topic indeed. Without further delay, I would like to invite Dr. Chandra. Thank you very much.
The chairman of the session, Dr. Farouk, friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Salam Sejahtera, peace be with you. Let me begin by thanking IRF, very close partner of JUST, for this very kind invitation. I'm happy to participate in your summer school program on the first day of spring, as far as the lunar calendar is concerned. This is the first day of spring. What I'll do is address the critical challenges confronting humankind today. Try to relate them to guidance from the Quran and Sunnah, and answer a question which is fundamental to reform in Muslim societies. Why is it that in spite of the advice given to Muslims for more than 1,000 years, why is it that today, as so often in the past, we are not able to apply that advice, guidance from the Quran and the Sunnah, in trying to understand and resolve the challenges confronting us? We know that this is what we are supposed to do. We are supposed to use the Quran as a guide, a barometer, a furqan, in our attempt to understand and resolve our challenges. And yet we do not seem to have been that successful. This is, to my mind, the crux of the core of the challenge of reform. We reform societies. Muslims reform the societies they are in order to reconnect themselves, Muslims, with the essence of Islam, the essence of the Quran and the Sunnah. That's the meaning of reform, as I see it, which I think reflects what Dr. Farouk had said earlier too. that we try to reconnect with the essence of Islam, which has a totally different meaning from the term reform or reformation in certain other civilizations. In our case, it's very clear. It is to reconnect, to reestablish that precious link with the essence of our faith. And yet we don't seem to have been able to do it. Which is why the challenges that confront us today, they seem to overwhelm us. Not just Muslims, but people from other religious traditions and people from other non-religious traditions too. We are overwhelmed by these great challenges. So I'll begin, friends, my discussion by first looking at the challenges. I look at the challenges, and then I shall try to link them with teachings in the Quran, the example of the Prophet, and try to answer the question, why has it been so difficult? What are the reasons for this? The internal factors and the external factors responsible for the situation that we are in. And towards the end, I will try to offer some possible solutions. I'm reminded all the while that this is a huge task, and what I'm attempting is something very modest. I'm sure that I will not be able to live up to my own expectations or the expectations of those who are here. But I shall try to perhaps probe this very big question to the extent that it's possible for a humble servant in this quest to try to comprehend this huge challenge. Let me begin with the challenges. I will focus on 7 challenges. On 7 challenges, very briefly. On 7 challenges, and relate them to the teachings of the Quran and examples from the Sunnah. What are the 7 challenges? Number 1, the environmental challenge. Number 2, the challenge of huge social and economic disparities. Number 3, the challenge of hegemonic power and violence. Number 4, the challenge of corruption and abuse of power. Number 5, the challenge of ethnic bigotry and religious extremism. Number 6, the challenge posed by the disintegration of the family in contemporary society. And number 7, final challenge, the challenge of the individual sustaining his or her integrity in the contemporary world as an individual. The first of the challenges, the environmental challenge. We are very much aware of this challenge. It is a huge challenge which no one would be able to ignore because we feel its impact. The challenge of climate change, which is very obvious, but also challenges related to resource depletion, challenges related to imbalances in weather patterns, and challenges and related to different forms of pollution. We know that the Quran has some interesting ideas about the environment, which is something that is very, very important for us to remember. The Quran tells us clearly that we have to protect the environment, that there is a very deep, profound, precious relationship with the environment, with the entire ecological system. This is what makes the Quran so contemporary, in a sense. What it tells us about our relationship with the natural environment. There is a beautiful line in the Quran which inspired a Catholic philosopher to highlight that line as the title of his book. This is the book by Christopher Veeramanthri. The late Christopher Veeramanthri died about 2 years ago. From Sri Lanka, a Catholic deeply influenced by his Buddhist environment. He has got this book which I hope you get a chance to read. It's a wonderful book. It is called Tread Lightly on the Earth. That's from the Quran. He writes about the perspective on the environment in 5 different religions: Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's an extensive, comprehensive, profound discussion by a person who was once the vice president of the International Court of Justice, Veeramanthri. He'd also written a book on Islamic jurisprudence many years ago. Now, in that book, he shows how the notion of balance, the idea of an equilibrium, central ideas to our relationship with the environment, they are encapsulated in various verses in the Quran. And how much attention was given to the environment at various points in Muslim history, long before the present era, by certain rulers, but also by the great sages. Now, why is it that we have never taken this advice? We're not even aware of it. In fact, we may be aware about so many other things pertaining to petty little details about what we think is Islamic jurisprudence. Little details about rituals and rites and forms and symbols. We would be very much aware about all those things. But this profound message about the environment, it has never really had much of an impact upon the Muslim mind, especially the Muslim mind in the contemporary world. Why is this so? We'll try to answer this towards the end of our discussion. Let me move to the second challenge, the challenge of poverty and vast disparities. Here again, we know what is happening. Just a few days ago, on the eve of the Davos Forum, that vulgar, opulent display of wealth among the elites. That's what the forum is all about. Now, on the eve of that forum, Oxfam, which has been very concerned about issues of poverty and injustice, they published, as they've done in the past, their annual report about the vast disparities that exist, which have become even worse in recent times. Let me quote very quickly certain passages from that report. 1% of the world's population, its command over wealth exceeds that of the remaining 90% of the world's population. Just 1% exceeds that of 90% of the world's population. 2,153 billionaires in the world, worldwide. Their worth is much more than that of 4.6 billion human beings. 62% of the total world population. These are the disparities. They're glaring, they're shocking, but that's the reality that confronts us. And yet we know, again, when you go back to the advice from the Quran and in other religious traditions too, because we're not talking about some of the other traditions, but the same sort of advice is there. This is unacceptable. It's very clear. Vast disparities, inequalities of this sort, it's totally unacceptable. The Quran urges us to redistribute wealth. Don't let it just circulate amongst a few. It's clear. Surah Hashar, verse 7. But there are other very significant dimensions of the Quran that urge us to ensure that there is justice, social and economic justice. I would argue that 5 principles that are obvious in Islam, they can be interpreted, each one of them and all 5 together, as a call to us to ensure that there is social justice. Zakat, sometimes referred to as the tax on surplus, but that's just one way of describing it. But there is one, zakat. Number 2, the prohibition on riba. 2, prohibition on riba. Number 3, the concept of waqf. It's also about wealth distribution. Number 4, the idea of faraid. Again, redistribution. And number 5, though not the least important, the concept of sadaqah. They're all part of Islam. Islam is not a religion that urges people to accumulate without thinking of the other. It is a religion that clearly seeks to bring about redistribution of wealth, of opportunities in society. And yet you have failed to heed this advice. Number 3, hegemony and violence. Hegemony, meaning by which the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a few at the expense of the many. That's what hegemony is. It can be at different levels: global, regional, national, even at the level of a campo, there can be hegemony. So we have to know what it means in its broadest sense. Of course, global hegemony, its repercussions are much more serious. It has led to war and violence. Millions have died as a result of global hegemony. Even in a situation where there is no Third World War, the total number of people who have been killed since the Second World War actually exceeds the numbers that had died in the First and Second World Wars, in all the hegemonic wars. Vietnam was a hegemonic war, Korea was a hegemonic war, Iraq, hegemonic, Libya, Syria, they're all connected with hegemony, this pattern of hegemony. And that's just within the Muslim world. Hegemony outside the Muslim world has been much worse, actually. Look at Latin America, the wars that have taken place, hegemonic wars in Latin America, including something that had just happened in Bolivia. Thousands and thousands of people have been killed. That's hegemony. Now, how does Islam look at hegemony? The concentration of power that we're talking about. In fact, a number of us have argued that hegemony is the antithesis, the negation, the nullification of the central principle of Islam. And what is that central principle? It is Tawheed. Tawheed is surrendering, engaged surrender to the divine reality, to God, to Allah. Hegemony is the attempt by either individuals or groups or nations to demand total surrender to them. They are demanding that they are in total control and should be held in awe because of the power that they command. Hegemony, in practice, is for that reason a negation of the surrender to the eternal being. That's what it is. So we cannot accept hegemony. This is how, if some of you remember this very interesting character from the resistance to the Italians during their rule over parts of North Africa, Umar Mokhtar. He argued, and parts of it you'd see in the film on the line of the desert, right, that the Muslim does not surrender to a foreign power. Not simply because the power is foreign. You don't surrender because you only surrender to God. That's the only conscious surrender. So any attempt to establish power over other human beings in any other form is unacceptable. And of course the consequences of hegemony, violence, war, debts, that further reinforces this notion of liberation as against hegemony. Liberation through surrender to go on. Now, yet another dimension. Corruption and abuse of power. Again, it's rampant. North, south, east, west. It's become worse. Partly because, I suppose, the circumstances which have given rise to the greater concentration of power and the means for avoiding accountability have become, in a sense, more pronounced. That's a challenge that we face today. It doesn't matter at what level of development you are. It does not matter whether you're a rich country or a poor country. But the problem of corruption and abuse of power is real. Here again, it's so obvious to us where Islam stands. It is against the abuse of power. It is against corruption. In fact, I've said this at interfaith dialogues too, it is the only religion where its principal scripture, the Quran, openly takes a position against corruption. We are told not to bribe the judges in the Quran itself. We are told why, through the practice of the Prophet, the Sunnah, why that sort of corruption is so wrong. The example of the guy who was entrusted with collecting zakat. Numerous examples in Islam. I use some of this in a book which Junaid's father published, a collection of my essays in this book called Muslims Today. And this is one of my own favorite essays, actually. And I want to quote from page 60 of this book called Muslims Today, what I regard as perhaps one of the most profound and one of the most incisive enunciations on the duties of rulers, their responsibilities, on why the abuse of power is so evil. It's just amazing. This letter that Sayyidina Ali wrote to Malik Ashtar, whom he had appointed as the governor of Egypt. If you want to teach a course on governance and administration, I can't think of a better text than Sayyidina Ali's letter to Malik Ashtar. How one should rule, how one should govern. Now he says, in this letter to Malik Ashtar, the richest treasure that you may covet should be the treasure of good deeds. Maintain justice in administration and impose it on your own self and seek the consent of the people. For the discontent of the masses sterilizes the contentment of the privileged few. And the discontent of the few loses itself in the contentment of the many. So live in close contact with the masses and be mindful of their welfare. He also cautioned the governor to observe rectitude in his conduct, especially in matters relating to integrity and probity. Sayyidina Ali advised Ashtar, Malik Ashtar, make it a rule of your conduct never to give even a small piece of land to any of your relations. That will prevent them from causing harm to the interests of others and save you from courting the disapprobation of both God and man. Deal justice squarely, regardless of the fact whether one is a relative or not. If any of your relations or companions violates the law, mete out the punishment prescribed by law, however painful it might be to you personally, for it will be all to the good of the state. Well, we don't have to talk about the multitude of Muslim leaders who have violated all these rules. It happens every day, everywhere. They give more than a piece of land to their relatives. And they've got away with this. And it happens in all religious traditions too. So here again you see this big gap between what is prescribed and what happens in reality, what is practiced. Let me now move to yet another example. And this would be in relation to ethnic hatred and religious bigotry. Again, it's something that is rampant. Even in Muslim societies, you have leaders and others who are guilty of this, of ethnic hatred. There have been ethnic massacres in Muslim lands. There has been religious bigotry. We have had the sort of extremism that we have not witnessed before. We look at Al-Qaeda and Daesh and numerous other groups. We're very much aware of this. But what is the Muslim position on ethnic hatred and religious bigotry? Here again, one of the things which makes me proud as a Muslim is its very strong stance against communalism, ethnic hatred, and bigotry. So much so that it figured in the Prophet's, peace be upon him, his farewell address, his khutbah wida to the Muslim people. Not to fall prey to ethnic hatred and to communal sentiments. The Arab is not superior to the non-Arab is not superior to the Arab, the white is not superior to the black is not superior to the white, and so on and so forth. And we know that even in his life, one of his closest companions, Umar ibn Khattab, who became the second caliph, he was admonished by the Prophet for a careless, reckless remark he made about Bilal, the Abyssinian slave. Remember Bilal, the Abyssinian slave? A certain remark that Umar had made, the Prophet at once admonished him and told him that this is something that has smeared him because of what he had said. And in fact, the Prophet choosing Bilal as the person, the voice that would call Muslims to prayer and elevating him above everyone else. This slave who was his companion, very close to him, especially in the last days of his life. That is a reminder to Muslims that there is no superiority in one's skin color, in one's ancestry, one's descent. This is why the late British historian Arnold Toynbee, he once observed that perhaps historically the greatest lesson that Islam as a civilization could offer humankind is its ability to demonstrate in reality that it can overcome ethnic and racial divisions. Of course, there are times when Muslims have also fallen by the wayside, but this ability to transcend race consciousness, which is what moved Malcolm X so much when he first went to Mecca and what he saw in Mecca. And yet today we have this challenge of racism, extremism, a challenge connected with negative feelings of this sort everywhere. And it becomes the ammunition for politics. There are parties that come to power, individuals that come to power, that consolidate their position because of this, the ability to manipulate this sentiment. Yet another challenge that I mentioned, friends, was in relation to the family, the disintegration of the family. Here again, it's no longer a phenomenon confined to any particular part of the world. It's become global. First, it was extended family that disintegrated. Now, even the nuclear family has disintegrated in many parts of the world, with all their consequences from this process of disintegration. Because in many ways, the family is the most stable unit in any society. The position of Islam, like the position of all the other religions, especially Confucianism, It's very clear as far as the family is concerned, how important the family is. And respect and love and the importance of preserving and perpetuating positive feelings towards each other, members of the family, however distant they may be. This is something that is mentioned over and over again in various Islamic traditions. Friends, I'll now come to the seventh and last of the challenges. This is the integrity of the individual, the crisis of the contemporary human being. And there are two contradictory dimensions in this crisis, which is a very profound subject that should be discussed perhaps in other settings. One, it is the way in which the dignity of the individual has been trampled upon everywhere, not just through wars and killings, poverty, destitution. That's one of the great challenges facing the individual. The paradox is the same individual is also living at a time, in an age, where the individual ego knows no fetters. The individual ego knows no limits. And it's glorified. It is seen as something that is noble, that is sublime, this notion of the ego. And it is elevated through the film industry, through sports, through everything, the ego, to a point where that has become a challenge in itself. That's the contemporary age, the contradiction, trampling upon the dignity of the many and then elevating and eulogizing the ego of a few. Here again, Islam has a very balanced view of the individual. It recognizes individual talents and ability, but it also celebrates the dignity of all human beings. Again, this is a verse in the Quran which is not highlighted. This is Surah 70, verse 17. This is the verse about the dignity of the human being. Karama insaniya. It's a beautiful verse that we created the human being in dignity and placed him over the seas and the land. But this is another example of something that we ourselves have not paid any attention to, both in terms of our religious teachings and actual practice, of course. And the ego, Islam, like all religions, it subordinates the human ego. It knows the danger presented by the human ego. One can argue that each and every one of the major rites and rituals is an attempt to overcome our ego. Whether it is the prayer, it's the proclamation of faith itself, the prayer, or the fast, or the performance of the Hajj, or giving of the zakat, it's somehow related to this very, very important challenge that all human beings face, all of us. So that brings me to what I wanted to explore. Why? Though the advice is so clear and the guidelines are so obvious, why is it that we have failed? Both at the individual and at the collective level, as human beings, as Muslims. Friends, I'd like to try to understand this through quick reflections on the internal factors and the external factors. The internal factors, again, something that even students of society looking at Muslim history have not really highlighted. We talk of the Khulafa Rashidin, the righteous caliphs. We talk of the great achievements of Islam in the early period. And rightly so. But we do not highlight the way in which power became all-encompassing shortly after the first two caliphs. It began actually with the third caliph. Not so much his own personal leadership, but the situation around him and the people around him. And later, as you know, in the time of Muawiyah, it became a real challenge, a problem, where power became institutionalized to such an extent. A faith which at the beginning had rejected the transmission of power through the family line, but it became institutionalized, and you had the situation where hereditary rule was clearly structured within Islam. And feudalism that Islam fought at the beginning, it became part and parcel of Islamic civilization. This, to my mind, is something that we must keep in mind, that the decay began within. Internal factors, the way in which one saw power, and the way in which one began to hanker after power. Some of the Muslim rulers in the early period. Of course, sometimes we don't want to evaluate their leaderships critically, but you have to look at the reality. As I said the other day at another meeting, that it is something that we are not proud of, but it's true that 3 of the 4 caliphs, the righteous caliphs that we talk about, were assassinated. And it revolved around the question of power and position. So this has been an eternal challenge for the Muslim world. I would argue that even to this day, we haven't really resolved this challenge of power. So that's one of the major weaknesses. And when power, even in the early period of Islam, got wedded to religious authority, in other words, religious elites justifying the abuse of power, it had happened, supporting those who were in power, and of course those in power supporting those religious elites. So you had a situation where by the 10th century, this had become a commonplace occurrence within Muslim states. The link between elites, political elites, and religious elites. And this led to the decline of the faith. So I would see this as the major internal flaw in the Muslim world. The question of power, the relationship between power and religious authority. The negative aspect of that relationship. We know that there were great caliphs who supported scholarship. We know that. We know there were great religious personalities right through history whose lives were a testimony to selflessness and sacrifice. All that is true. But at the same time, there was also this other aspect of our history that we should keep in mind. Friends, if you turn to the external factors, yes, there are external factors, but sometimes you cannot distinguish from the internal factors because they reinforce one another. Of the external factors, there are some students of Muslim history have argued that the Crusades was a challenge to the Muslim world. But in terms of its impact, the impact of the Crusades upon the Muslim world as a whole, the mores, the norms, the practices, the impact was very limited. The impact of the Crusades was limited. It didn't change the Muslim world, the Crusades, it didn't. In fact, the Crusaders in Europe changed much more as a result of the Crusades than the Muslim world. That period from 1099 to 1187. It was not a very long period in history. It was quite long, but still, the impact was very, very limited and of not much consequence. In terms of external factors, the first major external factor was, of course, the Mongol invasions. That would be the first, to my mind. Invasions by the Mongols from the Steppelins for the good part of 2 whole centuries, the 12th and 13th centuries, according to the modern calendar. 1258 was the culmination of it, the sacking of Baghdad, the greatest center of learning in the world at that time, and how it was destroyed. But even before and after that, Samarkand, Aleppo, a number of other great cities were all destroyed by the Mongol invasions. It had a very big impact because the Muslim world that emerged after the invasions, it tended to be very cautious, wanting to preserve what it had rather than be innovative and adventurous, because it was afraid that if it adopted the attitude of the early centuries, the religion would become even weaker because of what had happened, the massive trauma from those conquests. And then, of course, colonialism, a few centuries later. Western colonialism, that had a major impact upon the Muslim world, in changing the Muslim world, because it was in many ways total. It's not just a conquest of land, it was a total change to legal system, judicial system, to politics, to the economy, everything. That also weakened the Muslims. And then the post-colonial world that we're in. Because while formal colonialism is no longer around, if you look at the economic dimensions of power, technology, science, information, culture, it is still very much alive. And it impacts upon Muslims. And as a people who had exercised power at one time, and you see this very clearly in the context of India. In some respects, the Indian Muslim component of the Indian subcontinent, which was huge in terms of numbers, had felt the impact of colonialism much more than the Hindu component, because the Muslims were in charge before the British, the French, and the others took over. And they felt the impact of that dethronement much more, which is why they have never been able to adjust to colonial rule. And when revolts took place, in a sense, the first revolts were actually from the Muslims against colonial rule in India, even though they were not the majority of the population. So that gives you an idea of that relationship between Western colonialism and the Muslim world. So the impact has been very, very great. And we are still feeling that impact. Internal factors, external factors, reinforcing one another. It has brought us to the situation today. And we ask ourselves, and this is my concluding segment, how do we overcome this? What are the possible remedies? I would like to suggest that if you begin with ourselves, leadership is undoubtedly a major factor. If there are examples of some Muslim countries that have succeeded, invariably it is because of leadership. Leadership. Leaders who are able to do certain good things for the people, who are upright, committed, who know how to administer, to govern wisely. that is very important. There is no prescription for this sort of thing. You can't send them to a training school or something of that sort. They sometimes emerge, sometimes they don't emerge. The other factor, which I think is very important, is good leadership, if it is there, must pay attention to education. That's the future, education. In all its dimensions. But what is most important is to develop a critical outlook, which doesn't happen in many, many societies. Colonized societies and societies that have not been colonized. You don't have this sort of critical thinking. People talk about how successful the Chinese education system has been, but it is an education system that doesn't place emphasis upon critical thinking, which is why I feel that there'll come a point when it will have to pay the price. You have to develop critical thinking. That's very, very important. Develop science and maths not as disciplines per se, but what they stand for. What mathematics stands for as a discipline, what science stands for as a discipline. So important. A total overhaul of the education system, which in our own country, Malaysia, we had never really attempted, even though there have been good intentions at different points in our history. And within this concern for education, I would argue that you have to look at religious education. In Malaysia, we just carried on from the pre-colonial period, as far as religious education is concerned. Islamic education, the curriculum, there wasn't much change. And we are seeing the consequences. There should have been an attempt right from the beginning to develop a different approach. To put it very simply, I would argue that the 2E approach to Islam would have served us well if we had done it from the beginning, from 1957 when we achieved our independence. What is the 2E approach? Educate and enlighten. As against the 2P approach, which is dominant, which is prohibit and punish. Islamic education, the emphasis is on prohibit and punish. 2P approach. And that is reflected in our notion of Islamic law, in our approach to other aspects of Islam. But what we need is something else. It is engagement, education, enlightenment, that sort of approach. It may not be too late to do this. In Malaysia and in many other Muslim countries, I know that this is a major challenge that confronts everyone. That's at the level of the nation state. I think there has to be cooperation among countries. I'm one of those who argues that this sort of cooperation should not be based upon religious affiliation alone. In other words, one calls for cooperation among Muslim states as if all these challenges are peculiar to the Muslim world. They're not. Every one of them. Growing gaps between rich and poor, corruption. These are problems that confront humanity as a whole. And I think we must learn to cooperate with people, human beings, who are confronted by similar challenges. For what it's worth, ASEAN is an example of this. It is a regional entity that has worked to some extent, but it is made up of people of different religious backgrounds. If you compared it, and perhaps it's not a fair comparison to the OIC, ASEAN has been more successful than the OIC. So I think we have to get out of this thinking that if we cooperate, it must be amongst us. We have to cooperate amongst others who share similar challenges and who face similar problems. Because very often neighbors face these problems, and you have to learn how to cooperate. in order to bring about these changes, both domestically and regionally and even globally. And finally, I think there's a tremendous need for a global movement for reform, for change. All of us have been trying to do it in different ways, but I think they should all continue to work. You don't need a single movement, but different movements working together and sharing common platforms where necessary. The climate change movement is a very good example of how people have come together from totally different backgrounds, common cause. Shouldn't there be a common cause for liberation, for autonomous thinking, a common cause against hegemonic dominance? Can't we build these common platforms? Accountability, for honesty, for fighting corruption. I often give this example, so I am repeating it here, and I hope no one will feel offended. I was saddened some years ago when I found that Muslims very quickly, right across Europe, set up a movement to fight what the French government had done on the hijab. You remember there was this big issue about the hijab in France? And many of the groups came together because they felt this was something very, very important. I felt saddened because I asked myself, why is it that Muslim groups right across the European continent and in other parts of the world could not come together in huge numbers, could not fortify their relationships with the purpose of ensuring accountability, greater accountability, fighting corruption in their own societies? They're not prepared to do that. Some leading figures in the Muslim world were part of this movement, actually. But when it comes to things like this, accountability, honesty, maintaining a principle that is so important in governance in Islam, the principle of trusteeship. You're a trustee. How many of us can say, because all of us are trustees, all of us are Khalifa, how many of us can say that we uphold that principle in our lives and whenever we are given a little bit of authority? But somehow this doesn't move the Muslim world. So I think there is a need to develop global platforms, global mechanisms for acting and working together that goes beyond our fascination, which is perhaps understandable, our fascination for things that appear to be in the realm of forms and symbols. Let us move to the substance of things. That's what matters. This is where we have failed, the substance, rather than just the forms and symbols. That's where hope lies for the future. Thank you.